So you can be fine all day until you hit that point of exhaustion in the evening. And those instabilities come up and it show you basically who you are, where the cracks in the pavement are. Whether you're more sensitive to light, whether you're more sensitive to sound, whether you're just irritated with everything around you. So you're looking at these components as you bring up your resilience, those things fall away.
Hey, welcome back to the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. I am fascinated with performance on all levels, physical, mental. These are inextricably linked. And while I spent a lot of time talking about the physical aspects of performance, and to be honest, I think I'm obsessed with the physical aspects of performance. I may be even more obsessed with the mental aspects of performance that people just tend to take for granted, neglect, and not realize that your mind is the very thing that's either going to carry you where you want to go or inhibit you from going where you want to go. And as is your body in many instances, right? And one of the things that I aspire to do for you, my listener, my customer, my client, my fan, whatever you happen to be in this world, what I hope to do is remove the barriers, remove the walls that both you set in your mind and that your body sets for you. And what that means is, if your body is physically limited, if your physical capability is in any way limited, your life is limited. You're going to make decisions based on your inabilities rather than what you want to do, what your desires are. And this is the same with your mental capacity. If in any way you are limited in your thinking, in your mental capacity, in your discipline, then you're literally restricting what you're capable of in this world, in this life. And to me, that sounds like prison, right? That sounds like restriction that can be lifted by our own desire in most cases, right? Obviously, there's extenuating circumstances that are outside of our control. Today's guest is someone that is viewed as a leader in the performance space as far as cognitive capability. Dr. Drew Pierson is a performance specialist. He's been practicing EEG biofeedback since 1996, along with other neurocognitive therapies. In his early work, he specialized in pediatric for attention disorders, depression, anxiety, autism, and seizures, these types of things, and ultimately medication-resistant conditions. Then he later focused on generalized practice and then into peak performance. Dr. Drew is very well regarded in the space of cognitive optimization, specifically neurofeedback. He is a leader and a pioneer in the space. He has been regarded as the man to go to for brain optimization when it comes to external modalities to optimize the internal environment, which means neurofeedback, neuroelectrical stimulation, and the such. Today, we talk about how EEG brain training ultimately works and why it may be something to consider for people who are looking to achieve the highest level of capability. We talk about why learning to control your states of consciousness is a key to performance. We talk about an unstable brain and what he calls a blue brain and how to figure out whether or not you may be experiencing this. We talk about the powerful gut-brain connection and how to ultimately intervene for health, longevity, and high performance. We deep dive into brain states or brain wave states, how to assess them, and ultimately how to use this to your advantage. This is one thing that I started doing probably in 2012, understanding the various brain states and its impact on me, my life, my performance, my sleep, my recovery, my relationships is remarkable. I feel like it's a superpower for me. I feel empowered to be in the peak state of arousal at any time because I choose to train myself to get there. I can choose to be in alpha. I can choose to be in beta. I can choose to be in theta. I can choose to be in gamma. I can choose to be in delta. And I can use supplements to get me there. I can use brain training to get me there. But ultimately, I need to learn how to use those tools. It's kind of like having tools in a tool belt to be able to access the peak state of physical performance and mental performance to match. So, ladies and gents, I know you're going to love this podcast. I loved my conversation with Dr. Drew Pierson. Today's podcast is brought to you by our friends over at Mag Breakthrough. Bioptimizer has done it again. My single favorite magnesium product in the market. Why? Because it has 7 different magnesium chelates. Why do you care about 7 different magnesium chelates? Well, because each of them has a different bioavailability in the body. Each of them has the tendency or the predisposition, the propensity to attach or work on a specific tissue in the body. And so some magnesiums work better for certain people and some work better for other people. So having 7 different types of magnesium has you covered on every different level that magnesium is required in the body. Magnesium is required for 700 different processes in the body. If you're not taking magnesium, you're missing out. Ladies and gents, this is one of my 5 non-negotiable everyday supplements that I just simply never miss. In fact, I always take magnesium in the morning. I always take magnesium post-workout, and I always take magnesium before bed. I don't always take a lot, but I always take some. And I actually gauge the amount that I need based on stress. If I'm increasing my training, if I'm stressed, if I'm got a lot going on, if I haven't slept very well, then those are things, this is a lever that I pull to modulate my nervous system. You guys know the soil in the world is super depleted. The micronutrients are very depleted, and ultimately we need to supplement with certain specific things that ultimately get depleted more in these soils. So we need more magnesium for sleep and energy metabolism and recovery, and Magnesium Breakthrough is by far my favorite product. So ladies and gents, head over to magbreakthrough/muscle intelligence, and you can use the code MUSCLE10, MUSCLE10, to get 10% off this incredible product. And because you're awesome and we love you, and Bioptimizers takes great care of us, you can actually use the code MUSCLE10 at bioptimizers.com to take advantage of discounts on their entire site. Do it now. Take advantage of this sale and support the company that supports this podcast so we can continue to bring you the best free to consumer information. Ladies and gents, enjoy the podcast with Dr. Drew Pierson. Dr. Drew Pearson, sir, welcome to the show. As I said, you are very highly recommended by someone that I regarded very, very highly, a previous guest of the show, Matt Gallant, and shout out to Matt if he's listening. I'm sure he will. If he sees you on a podcast, he's going to want to get some deeper insights, and he knows that I usually ask some pretty deep, prodding questions. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Where are you in the world?
I'm in San Diego right now.
Good place to be right now. Beautiful place to be. Have you been there most of your life?
Off and on. I was stationed here in the military early on. Then I came back, and probably the longest I've ever been in one place. So,
yeah. Is that what kind of kicked off your interest in neurophysiology as being in the military, or did it happen prior to that?
It did, actually. That did kick off a lot of the thought processes because I was a fitness coordinator for a subgroup, and it just really extended from there. Because after the muscle stuff is done, what do you do with the brain? How do you optimize that? And it was kind of an organic flow toward that state.
Now you're talking my language. So that's literally, I mean, you've taken it to a different level than I have, but that's my transition as well. I started off as a professional bodybuilder and realized that the brain is everything ultimately, right? And understanding how I can get more out of my body is ultimately understanding how I can get more out of my mind, understanding how I can optimize peak states of arousal, how I can ultimately bring my mind out of a peak state of arousal and be into a more recuperative, regenerative state. So these are the things I want to dig into today. So if you want to talk a little bit about, what you were working on in the military as far as physical optimization and what your first, kind of path into brain optimization looked like.
It didn't happen quite there in the military. I mean, I was introduced to the physical fitness, and we had to keep up, a certain level of fitness just to be on board. Afterwards, I dropped into Gold's Gym and became a trainer there early on.
San Diego?
Yeah, in San Diego. And that became very boring very quickly for me. Are you doing 10 reps? Are you doing 8 reps, drop downs, eccentrics, all the fun stuff, right? And it became very boring, very predictable, and very narcissistic in most cases. And I got into more Eastern philosophy then, started really going into stepping out of physics, much more into more of a quantum realm and doing psychology. And once I really got into everything from Jung's work, the flow state that it really came out with Csikszentmihalyi in the 90s kind of influenced me onto, okay, how does the mind work? And once I saw the EEG, I went, oh, we can control this. We can take that and relearn our connections, our networks, how we produce ourselves in the world. And it's all about self-regulation at that point. Can you turn your switch on? Can you turn your switch off? Are you overthinking? Are you underthinking? What's your attention level? And probably in the late 90s, I never looked back after that, because the EEG is a beautiful thing and we can determine a lot. And there's still a lot we don't know at the same time. So it keeps me engaged and interested. And I see the transition of maybe a normal high functioning individual into an exquisite state of just concentration and relaxation and ease of product. Basically, the endpoint being more of a flow state that we look at, and the ability to just control these states of consciousness. And then once you gain the control, where do you go with that? And that's what I'm really doing right now.
That's amazing. So ironically, I actually did multiple hours of EEG last Friday, just a few days ago. Leaving there, I wasn't really given any action items like, hey, this is what I see and this is what you should do to intervene and improve. And that's kind of where it seems to break down for most people, I think, is, the only intervention that I've ever been aware of is neurofeedback. And I'm sure that's one intervention, but I'd be very curious to, maybe if you want to walk us through what you're looking at when you're looking at an EEG and the different states of kind of brain electricity and brain excitation, I guess. If you could define that for the average listener, and then we could walk through maybe what you're seeing on a typical brainwave scan.
So typically we'll do a brain map before we start anything. And in that brain map, I'm looking at all the metrics. We're looking at power, how much power these neurons. We're looking at connectivity. We're looking at asymmetry. We're looking at within that connectivity, the coherence, how well they're communicating back and forth between these networks and these nodes in the brain. So we can really reduce it down to different areas communicating in a very specific way under different loads. And once I look at that, like a lot of high functioning people have a certain amount of OCD. Their prefrontal cingulate is kind of a little bit overfiring. They're overthinking things. They're really pushing hard. It might take a little bit to perform well, but that also gets in the way. And once they learn to control that, turn it on and off based on what they're doing, life becomes a lot easier, and they don't fall into that aspect of overstressed individuals that have a breakdown, 3 to 5 years into something really intense. And so we're looking at those things. I also look at slow cortical potential, and that's produced more by the glia cells, the different cells in the brain. And what we're doing is looking at the core value of kind of like the electrical system in the brain. How is this cortical potential? Because once you bring that up to a certain point, or you can control that, you can turn full areas of the brain on and off. And that's the key to any state change. And then as we start training, we're looking for efficiency. And probably what you experience too, neurofeedback is very nebulous. You get hooked up and you're looking at a visual process, right? Your screen, and you're getting an auditory process. Sometimes you have tactile processes to give you feedback too. For blind or deaf individuals will use something like that. Or with autistic spectrum, the vibration is it may be very good for them if it's not too overstimulating. And once we look at those different components, you're looking at the screen, you're hearing the audio coming back to you. By the time you're aware of that, the process has already happened in the brain. The neurons have already fired, and they've already reset by the time you're aware of anything going on. So if you're consciously trying to control this, you've already missed the boat. So all you have to do is be that reflection, that mirror, and you're the eyes and ears for the brain. So you're just watching easily, basically, in a way that you can take in the information and not be attached. You have intentionality, which you want to set up beforehand. So the brain with intention, if you say, hey, I want to do well, I want to focus better, or I want to get more relaxed, you have that intention. And by the time that information comes back through and you've already set that intention, it's going to start modulating how the brain fires. And it doesn't matter what frequency it's in, it depends on more state changes. And then we can get dialed down into the frequencies. Basically, everyone has all the frequencies all the time. It just depends on what's dominant and where, and the signaling between networks and nodes, and the communication between them, whether it's over control or under control or a balance. And then at that point, once you train enough, you become very efficient. So you don't need as much of a push to get into those states. It becomes ingrained. much like muscle memory. If I asked you to do a bicep curl right now, you would know exactly how that feels. It'd be very easy for you. But if you've never done one before, it's a whole different game.
Fascinating. So you mentioned something there. I actually don't even remember the term specifically, but it was kind of in the realm of like the power that the brain is putting out. And obviously that's a very individual thing and likely variable at certain times of the day, certain times of the year. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that and how much we have influence over that. Is that genetic? Is that age related? Is that health related? All the above? Could we walk through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all of the above. I mean, there's a number of different factors. So you have age related kind of degeneration that may happen due to environment and stress. We don't want that. And I'll go into a little bit more of that in a moment. You have genetics, our family with ADHD or epilepsy will tend to pass it down. You have the ability to control it throughout the day, but there's optimal windows when people feel the best, physiologically, when the brain and the body are warmed up, when you're balanced. But with all that being said, the most important thing here is sleep. And that's one of the first things we always work on. If you don't have a great sleep architecture, then your days are suboptimal. And you don't wake up well, your attention scores are down, your speed of processing is down. You're not having these incredible ideas that you should be having or have the ability to have because you're just struggling with a deficit all day long. And once you really bring yourself back up to the point of your lack of sleep deprivation, I mean, there's so many people out there, I test, especially with high-end executives, they're always sleep deprived.
Yep.
And they say, oh, I'm fine with 5 hours. They're not. Neurologically, they're not. And we see that as they get, over 50, over 60 years old, we see the degradation that happens. We see the slowing in the frequencies in the prefrontal cortex. And it really takes away their sharpness, takes away their focus and their processing ability and their ability to shift. We want a brain that responds when it's needed, not to be on all the time or off all the time, or in this satori state, this enlightened state, just kind of blissed out all the time. We want to be able to engage when we want to engage and then go into these other states when we choose. And part of it's energy metabolism, right? Your mitochondria are a big thing. I'm a big proponent of not only sleep, but getting the right energetics going into the brain. So I'll use the combination of cranial electrical stimulation, PEMF or pulsed electromagnetic fields, which is by far my favorite. And then you could do adjunct, whether it's photobiomodulation, which is turning out to be a very powerful mechanism for slowing down of the brain, dementia, Alzheimer's, and post-COVID too. So if someone comes in with that COVID brain, the brain fog, and photobiomodulation really helps that sharpen back up. This is what we're seeing.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So if we were to start, again, we could talk about this for hours, I'm sure. If we were to start kind of going through each of those interventions to increase electrical capacity in the brain. So you mentioned transcranial stimulation, PEMF, photobiomodulation. Would the intervention depend on what you see at the level of the EEG, or would you say there's a certain protocol that maybe standardized, like, hey, everyone would benefit from these protocols? Because I think those in general are things you can access at home, maybe not the electrical stimulation, but in general, those are things that people may just have in their home. Like, I've got a PEMF mat now, is it directly applied to the head, or is it just like the vicinity, or how does that all work?
Well, it depends on the power and the frequency, really. Like, I'll use the pulse PEMF, and it's a giant machine. It's not anything that's really portable, but it's powerful. The more acute something is, the more power you want in that moment for like something like pain. But a lot of chronic condition, you could use the mat and something that it's a long-term type. You don't need as much power typically in the beginning, and you can move toward once you start getting better. A lot of people tend to use PEMF at a certain power level. It's too strong for them in the moment. they can. They detox pretty quickly, and then they have some potentially negative side effects. I don't see much, but you get the headache, you get the all over flu feeling, basically, that may occur. And that's just the caveat of, pay attention to how much, you're doing power-wise into this. Now, frequencies, and you were asking, do you put it on the head? And I use certain devices for the head and certain devices for the body, like the pulse for the body, and then there's one that has a picotesla that I'll use for the head, and just a little electrical, and we'll control it based on the brain map. So we'll look at the brain map and go, okay, they're going to operate very well at this frequency. Typically, with a mat, a lot of people will be at about 10 hertz or 7.81 or 83, and the Schumann frequency versus alpha frequencies. And you can apply those to the head. Yeah, and what you're doing is feeding that information, that energy process into the mitochondria so they can operate better. And I haven't seen any problems with that. And it makes a huge difference very quickly. Now, with transcranial electrical stimulation like TDCS or TACS, alternating current versus a direct current, you want to be very specific about that. Can have intense results based on where you put it on the brain. And I use that in correspondence with their brain map or the outcome they want. Like, some people come in and want, hey, I heard about this DARPA protocol. I want to learn faster. I'll do that. Or, hey, I'm feeling kind of depressed. This is the shift we see prefrontally that we can adjust with these things, whether it's PEMF or transcranial. And a lot of times people will start learning how to shut off certain areas if you're using a TDCS or a transcranial DC current. So you could actually put an electrode in a certain place on the head and actually make it so it's not firing as much, so it quiets it down. Like prefrontally, we'll do that with someone that has an anxiety disorder or OCD, something that we look at beta spindles at, and we'll reduce those spindles so they can turn on and off at will, and then eventually not have it running in the background, kind of like one of those pesky apps that just never shuts out.
So this isn't something someone should be doing at home, arbitrarily guessing which parts of the brain they want to put on. This definitely needs to be done with the professional.
It's best to do that. There are certain instances that can lead to a lot of difficulties in someone's life. They're not doing the right frequency that could really impact attention for a bit. It could last days, even weeks if their brain is unstable. So we want to make sure someone's not neurologically unstable before we kind of go off on this path of stimulation. Photobiomodulation doesn't seem to have much of an issue and is a lot safer. So we use it in older adults a lot. You have a few different, basically, helmets out there that people are using now that will stimulate, based on the frequency. And a new one coming out Sunday has the ability to look at your frequencies and then feed back the proper frequencies to you based on your own brain. And that's a game changer. The other ones don't do that. So this is just a progression in the field.
Yeah. So you said an unstable brain, and I think that kind of brings us back to where we started in the beginning. You talk about these different areas of the brain that may be misfiring or not coordinated. Is that really what you're referring to when you say someone has an unstable brain? It's just like some area that's maybe overactive or others that are underactive?
In a sense, it goes much deeper than that. It means that the brain can be pushed off of its track very easily. So if you go in and someone's flashing light in a movie theater and you're going into theater, you have a very unstable brain. If you get very reactive to everything around you and you can feel your state changes, whether it's anger or crying or just reactivity, it's not very stable at that point. We want to get it so the amygdala is not screaming, or the insula is not overreacting to threat detection. And it can happen in different aspects. A lot of people auditorily and visually, the sensory processing becomes very unstable at their weak point. So you can be fine all day until you hit that point of exhaustion in the evening. And those instabilities come up and it show you basically who you are, where the cracks in the pavement are. Whether you're more sensitive to light, whether you're more sensitive to sound, whether you're just irritated with everything around you. So you're looking at these components as you bring up your resilience, those things fall away. So it gives your ceiling a much higher gauge to enact and engage with everything around you without being taxed.
So someone who's experiencing that, this is maybe a vast generalization, but is it like the overactivity of the amygdala? Amygdala is just firing kind of uncontrollably, and they're getting those responsive or those reactive emotions being kicked off?
Yeah, it can be part of it. Typically, we have a number of different networks that feed into it that are overfeeding, and telling it, oh, hey, there's a threat here. Let's react. Or underfeeding it. You'll get people that are just they miss the cues. They miss all the things that can lead them into danger, or they're creating the danger themselves just based on those very lightly stable or unstable networks in the brain. And we all have different parts of the brain that are stronger than others or overproducing. And we just have to gauge what the brain map says with your experiential aspect. So we'll go through some testing on that and see, okay, where do you fall in this peak performance level, and what do we increase? Do we bring up your resilience? Do we bring up your attention? Do we bring those wisdom centers online so you're not reactive? How is your emotional reactivity? How is the emotional intelligence? Are you able to gauge those things?
That's incredibly fascinating. So it sounds like, I'm hearing it correctly, we can isolate specific either aspects of the brain or functions of the brain that allow us to isolate specific desired end states. So if I want to be better emotionally regulated, if I want to be more capable of learning, you can specifically identify the areas that are deficient, bring it up to what you would identify as a peak performance brain state, and then create that.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. And within that, what we tend to do is once certain areas are very stable and very strong, they tend to lift other things up. So if there's an energy deficit in a certain area and a certain frequency, it can affect the slew across the whole range of frequencies. And once that's stabilized, all of a sudden the others start working better too. So it could have some really incredible benefits across the board.
What would cause an energy deficit in a specific area of the brain, like other than, blunt force concussion type stuff? Is this something we see? Sleep. Is this the reason?
Global typically. And depending on the weakness of the brain, it'll come up in certain areas and we'll see it pop up on one side or the other, or prefrontally or in the back. And as it progresses, it becomes what we call blue brain. And the reason why we call it blue brain is to gauge on our brain map that when you're a few deviations down out of the norm of optimal functioning, that the energy is just not there to produce those frequencies. And so you have a number of different things. Environment is a big thing. People that have had, everything from Lyme's disease to COVID, we'll see a lot of blue brains with those. Certain heavy metal impacts it. Lack of nutrients, the proper nutrient, whether you're not getting enough magnesium or potassium, copper, or whatever going on in your life. And a lot of people with irritation in the gut or Crohn's or IBS or something like that will also have a deficit too that we've seen across the board. So we always get the gut balanced out there too, because that's a big input into the brain.
Glad you said that. So blue brain, just to understand it in maybe layman's terms, is it like slow brain, a brain that isn't willing to or able to adapt to the environment of the circumstance, create the state that we're looking to?
Yeah, it doesn't create the state, but think of it more as torque. So we don't have the strength to get going. If you're pulling a big load, you just don't have it. You don't have the energy to output that type of mental facility to get into those states.
What would be some of the symptoms that someone sitting at home right now might be able to identify themselves as saying, hey, I have something that may resemble a blue brain. I should do something about this?
Chronic fatigue, is the big one. Afternoon slumps are a big thing. When you're pushed to a certain point neurologically, had a stressful day, you've had a number of meetings, you've had something physically taxed you, and you're not able to focus or plan or do anything sequential after that, was always a big thing. You're not able to get into creative states. You're not able to jump into flow. Let's say, you're a musician or you're a pilot. You're getting by, but you're not getting into those states where the clarity is, where the ease of function is. One of my mentors early on told me anything worth doing is worth doing effortlessly. And that means, it doesn't mean it's worth doing in a sense that it really gets into mastery. If you've done something quite a few times and mastered it, it becomes very easy in the flow. Someone that hasn't done something very well for a long time, especially someone with blue brain, is able to get into those areas effortlessly. It's a lot of effort to get there. And by the time they get there, they're neurologically taxed and they don't stay there. So it may be a blip and then they're back down again.
Fascinating. So again, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, it sounds like step one is brain energy, right? I need to make sure that I'm doing everything environmentally, sleep-wise, dietarily, gut-wise, to ensure that my brain has the adequate capacity to produce energy. Start there. Yeah.
Like, if you're going to do a marathon, don't go on a week-long fast right before that. It would really tax your system. But we tend to do that every night. We don't sleep well if we're not in a good routine, if we're not taking care of ourselves mentally and physically.
Yep. So if we know that's the base of the pyramid, let's optimize for brain energy. And so you mentioned a number of things there. Is there any specific nutrient protocols that you would advocate for? So if we know that we've got to sleep well, so anyone that comes into my community knows the top 2 priorities for optimization of performance are sleep and gut health across the board, because those are at the base of the pyramid. Moving up from there, is there any nutrients or any specific interventions? Like, do you see a huge kick up with aerobic fitness or anything specific nutrient wise that you're like, hey, this is a non-negotiable?
So as far as, like, let's start at exercise. Walking, it tends to be one of the best things you can do, like 45 minutes a day. Not the only thing. And people doing HIIT training or high intensity interval training for a very short period of time show a big boost during that too. You got your meditation and your red light therapy and your saunas and hyperbaric oxygen or feedback, which is hypobaric. Those all enhance that. PEMF enhances it directly. Nutrient-wise, MCT or medium chain triglycerides are a huge thing. Fats are a huge thing. Proper fat. Your DHA and EPA make a big difference on this. Coenzyme Q10, love that. With PQQ is a great one.
High dose or just like typical 100 or 200 milligrams?
It depends on the quality and how you absorb it. I tend to do sublingual. Glutamine with turmeric, with curcumin is another big factor for the gut and the brain. Okay. So let's say you're getting done with a big, meeting or a really hard test or a really hard workout. If you include glutamine along with the turmeric and curcumin, along with some adaptogen, it really brings you back rather quickly.
Just like supporting gut health and adrenal function to make sure the cortisol is working correctly.
And obviously you need the right amount of calcium, potassium, and magnesium, magnesium being a big factor. And zinc tends to be one of those ones that we fall short on a lot of times. And that helps create the myelin sheath and the regrowth, the neurogenesis.
Very cool. Would you mind going through and describing the delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma states? Because I've heard different theories from different guests as well as different experts that I've worked with personally on, what's the most important ratio of beta to theta, or, the percentage of alpha you're getting is most important, or you hear these different like approaches and theories No one's ever really been able to give a definitive answer. I'm sure it's different based on objective, but I'm curious if you have any insights into maybe just define those states for people or what they're most correlated with. I know you acknowledge that we have them all at all times, but if I were to go and do an EEG, what would I be looking for?
We really want to look at this in the state of architectural or cytoarchitectural function, not just an isolated band or frequency in the brain. And I can tell you probably all your guests were correct in their own sense. There's not one answer. If you're looking at like your alpha, well, where is that alpha? Is it being produced? Can you shut it down or open it up based on your performance? So let me give you a couple examples of this, and we'll walk through the frequencies then. So like if someone is doing an Olympic sport event, or they're going to throw a baseball, or they're getting ready for a big intervention where a lot of physicality comes into it, like if you're doing powerlifting, like if you're doing a deadlift or something like that. We need typically a pulse on the left side of alpha before it happens. And that means success typically in anything, whether you're throwing the touchdown pass or hitting that home run. You need that burst to happen there. If that's not happening, it's a micro state within a bigger state. So all the other components have to be there, setting that up for that to happen. And once that happens, everything else flows through. So it's just a small, brief intervention during that time, but it's very important. And if that doesn't happen, typically there's failure. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a learning thing. So within the frequencies, let's look at delta. Delta is low moving 1 to 4 cycles per second. And it's typically what we get into when we're asleep, and we want that architecture to be there. Now, if we have it up in power with our eyes open, that generally signifies there's been a brain injury. And we'll look at that. So you'll get someone that's been in a motor car or motorcycle accident, or, they've hit their head because they fell. They'll come in and we'll look at that. It's overproducing the delta because these cells have been damaged and they can't control the frequency. But delta in a bigger context is kind of like the ocean that everything else rides on. And if your delta levels are up proper, it's easier to fire the other frequencies. It's easier to control those other frequencies. That's why the blue brain, especially in delta, really indicates a poor functioning brain. And you may be functioning all right at home or at work, but the potential of you operating at a much higher state, if you have a blue brain and you're operating like that already, it is just astronomical. It really, a lot of people have much greater capacity than what they've been used to. They just haven't cultivated that. They haven't put in the time to really do that. Now, theta is the next frequency up. It's like 4 to 8 cycles per second, 4 to 7 cycles per second. So 7 to 8 cycles per second, that cusp between alpha and theta. But theta is more of the hypnagogic state. It's what we're producing when we're dreaming too. And you'll see theta come up in dreamlike state. When we're doing training and we're going into theta, what we're doing is going deep internal. So it's a lot. When you're between the years of 1 and 7 years old, typically, we'll have a lot more theta production, or we are predominantly in theta, and we become just the sponge for absorbing information. And as we get older, the brainwaves feed up into alpha and then into beta. But during that time, you're able to absorb information like you've never done before. So that's why people go into hypnosis or hypnagogic states will help them kind of learn better or process better. And it's also a state where we resolve a lot of early childhood trauma. So PTSD and childhood trauma, if we're working with theta or alpha theta, as we combine them, we do that for emotional regulation and basically bringing out these traumas out of ourselves and letting them go, because we'll hold on to them neurologically.
What's the magic potion? That's not normal water in there. What you got?
Oh, it's AMPK and glutamine and some cordyceps in here.
AMPK in a supplement form?
Yeah, liquid form. Trying it out. See how it goes. The next one up is alpha. And alpha is such a big bridge for everything. It goes from 8 to 12 cycles per second. And if you don't have a good alpha bridge, if you don't close your eyes and alpha is not coming up, that means usually you've suppressed a lot of trauma. And a lot of guys with PTSD that I've worked with in the military, you'll see that. They'll close their eyes, alpha is just flatline all the way through. And they're not able to get out of that fight or flight mode. And that's the bridge between that fight or flight mode. It doesn't mean that you don't want the fight or flight mode when appropriate, but when you close your eyes, that should shut off. It's like don't rev your engine in the garage, right? You're not going 60 miles. That's appropriate for the highway, not appropriate for the garage. And neurologically, we think a lot the same way. With alpha, it comes in bursts. It comes in what we call these alpha spindle. And typically, like if you're new to meditation or new to these altered states, we see it mainly in the back of the head. And as you get more advanced, it starts moving toward the front along the center line here. And really advanced, you start getting other frequencies layered on top of it. And it just shows the healthy brain. And once that moves all the way forward and we're training the frequencies there frontally, especially with alpha, these are the ecstatic states that we tend to get into when it starts layering the other frequencies. But alpha is key. If you're not producing enough alpha in very specific spots, then you're not going to get into these states. You're not going to get into flow without alpha.
Did you say ecstatic states?
Ecstatic states. The bliss. It's much like a whole body and a whole mental orgasm in a way. It's a kundalini response. And we see alpha being the cornerstone for some of these states.
So that just drew a great line in my brain, and I want to know if it makes sense. So someone then obviously who doesn't have this alpha state may not experience ecstatic states to the same extent that someone who does would experience. So someone potentially who's under less stress or not doing the meditation could expect to lose the ability to experience states of joy, states of ecstasy.
Yeah, absolutely. And
wow.
Alpha tends to be that predecessor for your ability for sensory integration too. So tasting food, if you're training alpha, it's not that the food is better, you're able to taste a wider range. You're able to hear a wider range. You're able to sense the visual kind of like expansion in your range too. I typically always train alpha before I go into a concert because it just enhances, being in the audience and being with everything. It just really enhances. That's why a lot of people do alcohol. Alcohol increases alpha, right? Marijuana increases alpha and theta typically. So, they're doing these substances naturally to kind of maybe gain a more sense, even though it dulls the senses on a whole different area in the brain. But naturally, if you can get into that component, it just really enhances what's coming in.
Yeah, so I just kind of thought for a moment there, or maybe felt for a moment there, like what enhanced alpha how it may enhance your experience in a concert. And it's almost like, for me, I mean, if this is wrong, it's just like connecting. It's like you're going to connect to the vibration, you're going to connect to the experience on a different level. Does that feel like, is that what you're...
It does connect. It'd be because your sensory processing is perfected at that point.
That's fascinating. Gosh, what a bridge you just drew there for, I think, all the listeners out there to acknowledge that as we age, so typically my audience is going to be 35-year-old high achievers and people who ultimately want to be the best version of themselves when they're 70, 80, 90 and beyond. And the absence of delta is going to diminish our quality of life. So this is like a big, light going off here at everyone's face. Okay, pay attention. this needs to be something we build into our daily routines. Otherwise, your quality of life. And again, would you say this is probably very subjective, but someone who isn't experiencing these states of joy and ecstasis naturally because of the absence of delta, would they be more inclined to pursue things outside of themselves to gratify themselves or achieve states of bliss with substances or things outside because they don't get it in their day-to-day life?
Yeah. So yeah, the absence of alpha typically it's a safety factor, right? So when we come upon something that's scary or reactive or could mean possible death, we tend to shut down this flowy aspect of alpha. And when that threat is gone, then what we do is that alpha will return. And we want that to alpha. Yeah, we want that bridge of alpha to cut back and forth and be able to bring up alpha when needed, and then shut it down when we're engaged or attention. The bigger component too is our ability to find pleasure in life, and a lot of times without that bridge, we tend to be very cynical. There's a lot of cynical people out there. Yes, they're awesome at finding something wrong in everything that you do, or the way you look, or the way you breathe. Let's take a couple, for example. Like I love doing couple synchrony training with alpha. So take two people and hook them up, and when they're in synchrony, what happens is that they start flowing together, and all of a sudden they're producing alpha together when both their brains are producing it at the same time at the right frequency to the right pace, and all of a sudden they start feeling different about each other. So the agitation, that angst that people get with just the normalization of, oh, I've been with this person a long time, and I'm just not really in tune with everything because of our stress from the outside. But once they start breathing together, like HRV, heart rate variability, doing the breathing together, and that enhances alpha too. And that's such a big component. And that would be one of the things I really would push with any team is do HRV breathing and do training together. Do it every day. So if you're on a lifting team together, right? Do it together every day. Just 10 minutes, just 15 minutes at the most, right? If you're doing that, all of a sudden you start working as a team. And I've seen that in some military kind of elite groups that I've worked with. When they start dropping into those states, we see the production uniformly across all the brain. And the ideas flow so much easier. If you have an executive group, the CEO, CFO, all that stuff, and they're doing the breathing or even doing alpha training directly, but if they're doing the breathing beforehand with the HRV and really getting into that heart coherence before every meeting, it just makes it so much easier. Everyone becomes much more agreeable. They're not a pushover, but they're open to new ideas. If you want to shut yourself down from new ideas, shut down your alpha.
Fascinating. So anyone who's in stress is going to lose their alpha. So the coherence breathing, we're looking at 5 to 6 breaths per minute. So maybe like a 5 in, 5 out, or 4 in, 6 out, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, I would go out longer. 4 in, 6 out, 5 in, 7 out. It depends, do you want 6 breaths a minute, 5 breaths a minute, and kind of find your optimal pace. There's a number of different HRV components out there that are very cheap, $100 that you can train.
Is there one that you advocate or prefer?
So there's a couple. Heart Math is the easy one to do.
That's the one you clip to your ear, yeah?
Yeah, it's very easy to use. And the Theta that's coming out here shortly also does that. And that gives you direct feedback on that. Everything else it's okay, but I would suggest those two.
You're connected to that company?
Yeah, I helped develop a lot of the programs in that.
But it's not out yet?
Soon. Hopefully within the next couple of weeks, it'll happen.
So I think when Matt was on the podcast probably 2 months ago, he was telling me about it. Does he have one? Or because he's telling me all about it. He's like, this thing's gonna be it. And I think I followed him on social media, but there's no.
He's looked at it. He's seen the beta version of it.
Okay.
But the final production is being produced right now, and it's being shipped. I don't even have one yet, so I'm kind of eager to get to it because it has the photobiomodulation, it has the heart rate variability, and it has the EEG all built in that you can just take around anywhere.
It's like a helmet?
Yes. Well, like a set of headphones, basically.
Okay. Yep.
Now, it's the problem with like professional neurofeedback here is it takes a lot of stuff. And with this, it just makes it mobile, and you can train a majority of things with it, about 80% of what I can do professionally.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. And I guess it's not a low price point then if it's doing 80% of what you're able to do in the clinic.
Comparatively, it is.
Right.
It'll be about $1,200.
Oh, that's not bad at all.
Compared to, the systems I use, they start at 10,000 and then go up from there depending on how much software and hardware you want to get.
Actually, looking at the physiology while you're looking at EEG or improving some of these brain outcomes, are you looking at kind of skin conductance? Are you looking at all those types of things as well when it comes to optimizing brain states?
In some people, yes, if that's required for them. We look at temperature, distal temperature. That's an easy thing everyone can do to train temperature. So if you typically have cold hands or cold feet, it's usually a stress response. And if you just train the temperature in your fingertips and your toes, it shifts everything metabolically.
When you say train temperature, what is that?
Yeah, you can hold a thermometer, or you can get a temperature trainer online for $20-$30, and just hold it and focus on it, and imagine the temperature going up, and your brain is going to respond to that. And it's going to increase the blood flow to those areas. And after a couple of weeks, you can actually increase the temperature of your fingers. And it means better blood flow, better oxygen exchange, better nutrient exchange. And it not only happens in the fingertips, it happens throughout the body. The vascular signatures shift. And we see that in the brain too. So it's better blood flow in the brain. And that's something very simple that people can do.
Yeah. Also, probably another reason why the cold exposure is becoming so prominent to help the body be more effective at regulating blood temperature.
Right. So you go in and it pulls everything together, but then you have the rebound effect afterward, and that's what they want to get into. And then you have all the endorphins and all the neurotransmitters that are produced because of it, and it's really wonderful for the system. Maybe not 100% of the people out there do well with it, depending on their disease or disorder. But a majority of people really benefit from this in short interval.
Dr. Pearson, we talk about a peak performance or high performance brain. What comes to mind as far as what the brain state may look like, as far as coherence and energy? And could you just kind of give us some desired end states?
So the first, what you want to do is make sure you have a calm system. You want this aspect of executive function and cognition and arousal and motor activation and motor planning. All these things have to come into play. And it's like dividing a symphony. So you want your string section to be in time with the percussion. You want your horns to emphasize at the proper moment and everyone be in flow. Otherwise, the cacophony, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to have this calm brain. And at certain frequencies, at high alpha or low beta, then tends to be one of the frequencies that we really concentrate on. It's called SMR, sensory motor rhythm. And it goes between 12 to 15 hertz. So we want to be able to produce that consistently under stress. So when you're coming into something, if you're relaxed in a central nervous system wise, your sympathetic is not screaming at you and the parasympathetic is balanced in there, you're able to change gears quite effectively. And that's what it really comes down to: control, efficiency and control, and the ability to step in and step out of deep states of consciousness. So if you're doing golf and you're swinging that golf club, but you get tight 3/4 of your way through, you're going to screw up that hit or that putt every time. But if you're flowing all the way through and you've already neurologically gauged that swing all the way through, it becomes easeful. And you don't even feel hitting the ball. It's just one of those ease of flow aspects. And performance-wise, whether you're driving, whether you're riding, you want to fall into these places that are in between the excitation aspect, the reactivity, and the relaxation. You don't want to get too relaxed where you're not engaged, right? Where you're kind of pushing in your clutch and you don't have any engagement at all neurologically. But switching in and out of those very quickly. Now, once you get to a certain point, we start seeing these buddings of upper frequency. So I touched on SMR, and that was the early research experiment back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he was one of my mentors early on. So he did the pilots at NASA and epilepsy, and he worked with SMR for epilepsy at first. And then we found out that it really enhances peak performance. So I'll use it in all my guys that do baseball, that play guitar, that are singing or whatever. And it just really enhances their ability to stay relaxed, but stay engaged. And then we get into beta, which we're kind of in right now, typically up to about 38 cycles per second. So we think and we do, and if you have too much high beta, like over 30 hertz, 25 to 30 hertz, we tend to really get into this anxious state. And that anxious state really pulls back your ability to get into the other state. And it takes away your efficiency. It's like pushing on your steering wheel to make the car go faster. It just doesn't work.
Right.
But it tires you out, right? And then you get into the upper frequency, which is gamma. And once you've trained alpha enough and trained theta enough, you start really increasing gamma at those exquisite states. And this is the frequency of bliss. This is the frequency of eureka, of aha. This is where you can take disparate ideas, bring it together and make it work. This is the insight frequency. And you tend to start producing gamma all the time once you've been training these other frequencies. It rides on the other frequencies, kind of like the surfer on the ocean. And it just appears and then disappears. It collapses just in spot. So like someone with autistic spectrum, they'll have almost no gamma. But as their cognition, as you train them and their cognition comes up, the gamma will start appearing. And
is the frequency range of gamma above 38?
38, we can effectively train probably up to 50, 55 hertz. Unfortunately, if we're not drilling below the skull, it's really hard, or if not impossible, to train above that frequency. We can look at certain frequencies with transcranial AC above those frequencies and stim it, or photobiomodulation too. We can get into the upper frequencies and stim it. We just can't neurologically get the right signal unless we're drilling below that skull.
Are you using different light waves or for light frequencies of photobiomodulation to achieve different brain states, or is it just like shining the light and it'll get there?
It depends on the frequency. So you have a number of different ones, like 635 or 810 or 960. Certain ones do better at certain cognitive factors. Certain frequencies you can use over a longer period of time. Certain ones you have to use a shorter period of time, or else it becomes just too much for the brain. But typically within the range between, like 700 to 1100 is kind of the sweet spot for, and that's a whole other subject of, what frequencies are you doing in nanometers versus, are you doing like a cool ether or something like that?
Is the Sensei going to have the ability to vary the range of frequency for light, or is it always the same frequency?
No, it it will change the range based on your brain. Now, we have certain ranges that we do because we know how they react to the brain. And if your brain isn't reactive to that, we can change the interaction of the photobiomodulation with the EEG factors.
Fascinating. The listeners out there, a lot of the listeners are going to go, okay, I want to access transcranial direct current or transcranial AC current. Would we assume that most brain clinics that someone could go into North America or Europe would have a general idea on how to do this stuff effectively? Or would that just be like a big stretch to assume that we'll know how to do it?
So you get a lot of people out there that do neurofeedback, right? They're good with one system. They've trained in one system, trained very well, and they get a lot of results. They may not go into electrophysiology, so they may not jump into the effect of what the transcranial ability is, because it's not either within their scope of practice. It's not within their, what they want to focus on. Certain places out there have everything: PMF, hyperbaric oxygen, down to all the brain stem. They have all the toys, right? And they're very good at it. So you really have to investigate what they do and why you want to be there. You don't go in and say, hey, I just want transcranial DC. I mean, if you want to do that, you can actually just order that off of Amazon and try that. There's a number of different things. And the effects are very transient with that and pretty well felt. So you'll understand what it feels like to be in these states. But you want someone that can do a brain map, want someone that knows the systems well and has had practice within that state. So if they're very new, it's very experimental. But there's a lot of really good practitioners out there.
I have obviously fear, not obviously, but I have a fear around entrainment and like putting current into my brain or putting even beta sounds into my ear. Any reason to be hesitant around this stuff, or is it pretty safe in general?
I would be hesitant in the sense that, like, if you have an anxiety disorder already and you're doing beta, right, it's going to impact it, and it might hype that aspect up in you, which really feeds into, and all of a sudden you can't sleep even more and you're on edge even more. Or if you're depressed and you do one of these and you have the propensity of the swing into depression for a bit, it can really knock you down. So you have to be very careful about these things. For most normal brains that don't swing like that, it's generally safe, but I can't say it's 100% by any means. Everyone reacts differently. You find out sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't know this was going on with me. I've been masking it by being and doing and being busy. And if I slow down and take a look at myself, there's a huge amount of fear. There's a huge amount of depression going on. And I've just been confident for that.
Do you have any insights on binaural beats? Do you think those are effective? Any validity or utility?
I really like them. It works into about 30 or 40% of the population. So it works really well for that percentage.
For what specifically? Like to induce that specific?
So let's say we're doing like 400 hertz in the left ear and 410 hertz in the right ear. It gives, we call it heterodyning. So we're looking at the separation of frequencies. So the brain starts oscillating at the difference, which is 10 hertz or alpha. And once it can catch that beat and follow along, it'll start oscillating at that frequency too. Now, people with auditory disparages and auditory processing disorders are not going to do as well. The majority of people process about 80% of their stuff over the left hemisphere if you're right-handed, about like 70% if you're left-handed in the right hemisphere. So you really have to gauge what works for you. Isochronic beat, or not the binaural beats, but this really gets down into beat frequency that is just this isolated frequency that you start following along, kind of like a drum beat in a way. And those work quite well too. Is it going to work for all the percentages? No. Photobiomodulation works better. At least that's what I see.
And no complementary.
Complementary. So the transcranial AC, if you're doing like if you place the electrodes on the mastoid, the site behind the ear, and you're doing 10 hertz, it tends to reset. So that's very strong. And I really like that with a lot of people.
Is there a specific unit for that one other than the Sensei that's coming out? Is there something that you use right now?
Sensei for photobiomodulation, it doesn't do the transcranial AC. Professionally, I just use professional systems for that. I can't think of anything on the open market that isn't consistent, that you can buy it consistently. They'll be on Amazon for a bit, then disappear. I'll have to really look and see what the consumer level stuff is. I haven't looked at the consumer level of that in a bit.
Very cool. What is the thing that you're most excited about with what you're doing right now? Like what's on like the tip of the spear in your area that's really got you excited?
I'm starting to do cerebellum training. And the cerebellum is it's the back of the head, right? And it contains a huge amount of neurons. And we thought it was just motor gate type stuff. When you're doing a test for influence or a DUI or something like that, they'll have you do the nose thing and balance thing. So what they're looking at is the effect of the cerebellum on balance. And what we're finding is the cerebellum does so much more. We're finding mood regulation. We're finding addiction. We're finding resilience coming from there. So by training this, it's really upping the output of what I've been doing recently. It's been a phenomenal find for me.
And how specifically are you training it?
Well, we put on a full cap. So we have basically 19 to 24 electrodes all around the brain. And we're looking 3D into the brain with special calculation. And when it lights up on the different layers in the cerebellum, we can train it, on and off based on the frequency, based on communication between them. I'm finding the balance between the two, communication-wise, coherence-wise, is essential. So once they communicate through the vermis, it's kind of like this moth-like thing that oversits the part of the cerebellum, communication between the two. And once that is really engaged strongly, one side, a lot of people have one side versus the other stronger, kind of like your right arm or left arm. And once you integrate those, it just makes life so much easier. You don't react as much. Your mood is better. You're not going into these, whether it's a major or minor addiction type of set patterns. So, are you jumping on your phone if you feel uncomfortable? Are you, gambling, or are you just doing things, whether it's drinking, whether it's other activities too, shopping, things that really fall into the category of compensation for this dysfunction. And that really helps those means get into balance so you're not just living in this reactive mode. And then the resilience goes way up. So your ability to handle stress goes way up.
Is the only way to train the coherence left to right or the balance, as you say, with some type of external entrainment with the direct current, or is there something I could be doing day to day that's, going to allow me to access that?
There's a program called Brain Gym that really helps. The cross crawl techniques are a big factor for that. And if you do those in the gym, if you set up a whole thing of Brain Gym in your gym, right, in your kind of daily practice, it may seem weird, but it will help people function better neurologically. And that's something you can do at home.
I'll absolutely look it up. I think I've used it in the past, actually. I've had a friend who's in the military who used to train me on that stuff, but I'll look up what kind of the latest advancements are and see, and absolutely report back.
And where I came up with this in functioning is I was training a lot of kids with learning disabilities and cognitive disorders, but they also played sport. And after they started doing that in combination, if they did it every day, the parents would make sure that they did it every day, they would start functioning better in their sport. It really impacted that.
That's fascinating. What does your daily time commitment look like personally to improve or optimize your brain function?
There's a couple things I do typically daily. I have a sound chair, a vibroacoustic sound chair that feeds my soul. It takes.
Is there a specific brand?
This is one I built. There are probably a couple out there, and Inner sense, I think it's one of them. And Stomatron, I think it's been 20 years since I've even had one. Yeah, I created the chair. I built a number of chairs back in the mid-90s that have vibroacoustic tactile information being fed through. So we can feed frequencies into the body. So I'll do that daily for recovery. I'll do the PEMF daily just for health.
And
sauna.
The pulse. That's like a big unit. You can actually feel that tactically, right? You can feel how strong that is.
It'll throw you off the table if you turn it up too high.
Yeah.
But it's a phenomenal one of the best units I've ever come across.
And then there's nothing wrong with something so strong you feel it. Like in general, go for it.
Again, with the acute disorders, depending on your practitioner, you could use that stronger effect, right?
Okay.
And then the more chronic stuff, it really depends. So like a lot of PMF units, it's all gauged in Gauss, right? Like, so if you're using the transcranial the TMS, the magnetic stimulation of the brain, they'll use up to like 30,000 Gauss, which is huge, right? A lot of the ones on the market that you use for mats only have 1 Gauss. You want at least 200 if you're going to get it. Don't waste your time with being too low. I mean, do they produce it? Yes, it's going to affect you. I doubt it. But get something that has a decent amount of energy that comes through, and it's going to range from $1,000 to $35,000 in the sense of what you get.
Yeah.
There's a doctor out there, Dr. Pollack, that has a good site that kind of breaks a lot of the different systems down, so people can look at his site and reference that.
So he breaks down all the PMFs?
Yeah, it's just a wonderful resource. Personally, I wouldn't, I'm going to use the pulse. That's what I have, and that's what I really like, and I get the effect.
Right. So Pollack is Pawluk, is that right?
Yes. I'll do brain training a couple times a week, typically in intense bursts. I don't train every day. With the Sensei coming out, I'm going to be training every day for the next couple of years, because there's a whole program for the next 2 years that comes out of that, and kind of really upping the ratchet, be able to meditate better, focus better, go into deep state better, produce the gamma better, right? To these exquisite states, help the creativity, help the speed of processing. And with that too, we'll be able to look at your speed of processing too. We'll be able to test it effectively.
Wow.
Which is a huge factor in being able to think on your toes and riff and be able to navigate anything that's not set and remembered.
Are you a guitar player?
I'm much more of a collector. I played back in the day, but I'm a better collector than player, for sure.
Are these special ones behind you?
Oh yeah, that's Zach Wilde from Ozzy and Black Label Society. This is from Queensryche when they played in MTV, Silent Lucidity, and of course Eddie Van Halen's piece here.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, I like those guys.
Yeah, and you don't take them down and try to keep up with Eddie?
I have other ones I play. I don't touch them.
Collectors.
Yeah, they're all played and signed. So, I don't touch them.
That's phenomenal. So I would predict, or I presume, that playing guitar would be incredible for creating a flow state, for creating optimized brain state. Does that sound like anything that seems like it requires that level of focus and mastery, what I usually associate with flow states?
Yeah. Anything like that, any physicality, whether it's opera singing or guitar playing or music in general, opens up the right side of the brain and really helps that creative flow. Like you and I, as males, we have this very small spindle in the corpus callosum across both hemispheres. It doesn't let information go through. Like women have a highway. We have a one-lane bridge. Well, we're much better typically at front to back thinking, and we don't integrate hemispheres well. And once that is integrated well, the creativity, especially training on the right side of the brain, really increases your peak performance overall. And we always train that, whether you're throwing a ball or, at the symphony or even riding in flow. Such an essential aspect.
Can you explain what front or back to front thinking means as compared to left to right?
Well, front to back thinking is sequential thinking. We're really good at building plan and doing that sequentially. People say they do multitasking. There's no such thing. You're fractionalizing attention in that sense. But these long, like if you want to increase your long connection here, like you can drink coffee and that'll be good for front to back thinking. But you don't want that if you're doing side-to-side thinking. So if you're going in, you're closing your eyes, you're going internally, you don't want to be hyped up on the factor of the adenosine blocking aspects of caffeine, right? You want to be able to have that free flow between the hemispheres. And I'll take certain herbs for that, or even I have a formula called Transcend that I use, and it's a dropper and immediately just opens everything up. And it's a quiet, contemplative sense between those areas. And once you get really good at it, you'll be able to flow in time. You'll be able to go back into attention and then drop back into these lower states of creativity, and not lower in function, but just a different frequency.
Is Transcend publicly available? Is that something we can just pick up?
Yeah, on Amazon.
Okay. It's just like Transcend dropper. I'll look that up.
Mm-hmm.
I like to make notes of these things because, we get questions in the show notes or to listeners. Transcend.
Where did I get this? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Herbs? What would it be? Transcending?
Radical Roots is the company that produces it.
Got it. Dr. Pearson, I'm incredibly grateful. I want to be respectful of your time. That was an incredible insight and deep dive into understanding what you do. I'm sure it's just a drop in the bucket, and I would absolutely love to make it down to San Diego sometime and spend an enormous amount of time with you. Do you offer multi-day deep dives, or is it typically a couple hours at a time? How do you typically work with people?
I really like to work on deep dives. So we do concentrated training, and I see the best results out of that. I'd love to have you down here to check it out.
How long does that go? How long does that usually go?
Typically, I like to spend either a full day or up to 3 days with a person. It really impacts. Well, let me tell you one other thing. If you have someone that meditates over a year, right? Let's say they meditate 1,000 hours over that year. If you have someone that does the same 1,000 hours, but part of that was done on an intensive, like a 10-day retreat, a silent retreat, they're going to have more impact on the outer end than the other person did that did the same amount of time but didn't have that concentration. Right. So we see huge gains comparatively, even though they've done the same amount of hours.
I believe it. I did a 7-day brain training in 2018, I think, in Sedona. I did are you familiar with BioCybernaut? I did.
Yeah, with Dr. Hart. Yeah, that's wonderful. It's a wonderful program. Yeah. So bringing up that alpha, really integrating. And when you're able to do that, you're really able to dive deep because it's layered on top of each other, right?
Yeah, it's something I wish I was able to go frequently, but obviously it's kind of cost prohibitive at some level. But just an incredible program for sure. I definitely saw enormous benefit, and I think still do see a benefit in just quality of life. It's almost like it's flipping a switch and allowing you to exist in a less reactive state and maybe a more present state, and maybe using more aspects of your brain that you didn't have access to before.
Yeah, and the alpha directly impacts the heart, and doing that changes the frequency that you're resonating at. Gosh, I have so much more to say, but
keep going. If you got, I love to hear it. No, I love to hear it. If you got time,
when that heart is going, and you're able to affect the people around you. Let's say you've been doing a lot of HRV training, a lot of that coherence training, and your alpha's going up, and people are going to react to you differently. You walk in the room, they go, "Oh, this guy is one big hug." I want to be by the energy. This is nice. And it really brings about the fact that our energetic means can affect other people. So there's some frequencies that we're working with right now. We're doing a study, and part of the study's been done before, but we're really looking at certain variables, but certain frequencies of theta in the prefrontal cortex. When you're doing a healing on someone, that tends to be the frequency we start resonating at. And people that produce that consistently have that healing effect on other people around them. And it doesn't matter the distance. I know this is kind of woo, but I'm seeing the effect, and it's rather remarkable what we're seeing. And, people see this in like Dr. Joe events, right? Dispenza. And people get into that state, and you'll get certain groups. And I know a couple of people went in there, and I know their groups because I know their brains. And they'll have that frequency going, and their group gets phenomenal results. So we're starting to train those frequencies in people that really want to up their healing ability, not only internally with themselves, but affecting other people around them.
This speaks even more to the statement that says you are the 5 people you surround yourself with. It's, at a literal vibration level as well, not just like at a goal setting and achievement level.
Yeah, it's so important.
I don't think this is woo at all. I mean, I think that we're vibrational beings. And I read a book recently called Healing is Voltage. I don't know if you read the book, great book, worth a read. Probably read along the lines of what you're talking about. It's like we have to be in this specific resonance. And if we're not, then the tissues in the body start to become dysfunctional.
Right. And that's why I like the PMF so much. If your voltage is down too much, you start falling apart. If your voltage is up, you're much less likely to fall into a disease state.
And so I hate talking out of turn about something I don't know a lot about, which is why I want to ask this one question kind of again, stated in a different way. With TMF, if I expose someone, myself or anyone for that matter, to a frequency, there's low likelihood that you're going to cause some negative.
Yeah, don't worry about the frequency. It's about power. I mean, the frequency can be gauged in aspects of like, if we're working with IBS and you need a higher frequency, like 440 hertz or something, but 10 hertz, it just covers everything, or 7.8 hertz, or like if you're working with pain at 2 hertz, those are very specific. It doesn't mean the 10 hertz won't work on pain like 2 hertz does. You may respond a little bit better, but over time, you're going to respond the same.
Do you have any resources or references where I could look and understand the frequency ranges? Because that would be so useful for me to understand.
Yeah, what I can do is send you a whole aspect of my research. I have a whole 4-hour presentation on the frequencies, and that I'll send you my PowerPoint.
I would love to see that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Anything else you want to share? Because I'm sure you got a lot.
We'll have to do a part 2 sometime.
I would love to. I'll make it in San Diego. We'll come down to shoot a YouTube video. We'll do a part 2. Dr. Pearson, I'm incredibly grateful for you making the time and for your wisdom and for your continued pursuit of excellence, both for yourself and for those around you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It's been an honor. Really appreciate your time.
Likewise. And that's a wrap, ladies and gents. So as promised, I will do my best to do a bit of a summary at the end of every podcast, the key takeaways, my perspective on what the guest has said, and maybe give you some insights into how you can make this information practical. So here's what I think you need to know. I think you need to understand that the state that you're in right now, that could be the state of arousal, meaning the energy state and the focus state. That could be the state of emotion, is all significantly influenced by your brain state. So if I want to change the way that I feel or the way that I think or the way ultimately that I'm performing, I need to think of the brain states like I'm shifting through the gears of a car. I'm going from first all the way up to fifth. I want to be able to access each of those states along the way. So what does that mean? Well, how do I do that? Well, if I want to be in a really calm, relaxed state, let's say I'm getting ready for bed, or I'm reading a book, or I'm meditating. Well, I certainly don't want to be in the same state of arousal as I want to be when I'm squatting or when I'm doing something really intense. Those are very, very different states of arousal. And this is not just at the level of the cardiovascular system that most people think. It's like, oh, I need to get my muscles moving. I need to get my heart moving. Yes. And you need to get your brain moving. So these things should happen in sync with each other. They should be in synchronicity with each other, or synchrony with each other. So why does that matter? Well, ultimately, we don't want to be someone who's always in the same state. And this is very common with many people. Many people are unconscious about the way they perform. They show up to places where they don't need to be high stressed. They're in a high strung environment, and ultimately they react, don't they, rather than ultimately respond. So some of the tools that I personally use to access these brain states are as follows. I think we talked about this a little bit in the podcast, but for a summary, I like to use something like L-theanine to calm me down. If I feel like I'm stressed, anxious, overwhelmed, I've done too much in that day, or I don't have a huge amount of time to sleep, I need to make sure I really calm down my nervous system, or I've got blue light late in the day, or I've got caffeine late in the day, or anything where I feel like, my nervous system is really overstimulated right now. L-theanine and magnesium are my two favorite ways to calm down the body. Something like L-taurine also is really good for increasing GABA, which can slow your nervous system down, slow your brain down as well. So those three, I would say, are my favorite go-tos. Magnesium, L-theanine, L-taurine are probably my favorite go-tos, certainly my favorite go-tos for calming the nervous system, calming down the brain, bringing you down more into that alpha state, maybe even into that theta state, which is that hypnagogic state that happens before sleep. If we want to get down into delta, ultimately, in my opinion, it's a GABA predominant system. So we want to push GABA a little further, which means we would need a little taurine, L-taurine, which I mentioned before. Another product that I use very sporadically, on the order of, I've had one bottle since 2016, is called Phenibut, which is P-H-E-N-I-B-U-T, Phenibut. It's one of my favorite products for inducing an incredibly deep state of sleep. However, it can be habit forming, which means if I use it 2 days consecutively, if you use it 2 days consecutively, you can become dependent on it, and it can prevent you from sleeping, or you need it, or you have to increase the dose. So I literally have used it twice in the last 12 months, maybe 3 times in the last 12 months. And the only time I tend to use it is if I'm going on a red eye, I'm going on a flight, it's very long, or if I'm like, geez, I got like 4 hours of sleep, or I feel really, really strung out and I can't get to sleep, boom, Phenibut. Keep it in a cupboard, don't use it often. As far as getting into an alpha state, which is this calm meditative state, we want to use alpha GPC, by far my favorite. Some people also suggest L-theanine to get into alpha state. If you're someone who lives in beta or high state beta, which is like stress and overwhelm and high level cognitive functioning, using L-theanine can actually bring you down into theta as well. Great dietary source of L-theanine is green tea. So having some green tea is an excellent way to consume some L-theanine. Obviously, there's the trade-off of sometimes green tea has caffeine in it, so we want to make sure that we're not having caffeinated green tea late in the day. But theanine and green tea, or the theanine that exists in green tea, is a really calming way to consume caffeine if you are someone who wants to take caffeine. As far as getting into states of peak levels of arousal, like getting up into high beta, I like to use L-tyrosine. So it's just another amino acid that's really, really specific on the dopamine pathway, and also works on the thyroid. L-tyrosine in lower dosages can be very effective. 400 or 500 milligrams is what I personally use. Now, these are not recommendations for you. This is not I'm not trying to treat or diagnose or anything like that. This is my personal kind of dosage range. And all these supplements are what's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe. So make your decision, talk to your doctor. But as far as increasing dopamine, increasing drive, L-tyrosine is phenomenal. And L-tyrosine I use personally anywhere between 500 milligrams, which is average, and I'll probably use that twice a week. But I sometimes get up as high as like 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams if I'm going in for like a big leg session or something, or a big deadlift session, and I know I haven't slept well, or I know I haven't nourished well, or I know maybe I'm not hydrated really well, or I'm just like dragging a little bit. I'll throw in additional amounts of L-tyrosine and ultimately L-carnitine as well. Acetyl L-carnitine can be very good for being excitatory to the nervous system without being too stimulating. Just don't go too crazy in the doses. This is one of those things that's definitely a point of diminishing returns. There's some data out there around dosage around 10 grams, which will absolutely induce anxiety for you, and you don't want to experience that. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that gives you a little insight. If you have the opportunity to do brain training, neurofeedback, go do it. It's a really, really great thing. Everyone should actually go get their brain mapped, which is just a QEEG, quantitative EEG, and get your brain mapped and see what parts of your brain are working well, which parts are not working well. See how optimized your brain is, so you can ultimately access the highest state of peak performance for you. I've been working with a gentleman here in Canada named Dr. Chris Friesen. Chris, if you're listening, what's up, man? We've got to get together. And I would love to continue to work on optimizing my brain. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. If anyone's in Canada or near Toronto, look up Dr. Chris Friesen. Hopefully he'll be a guest on the show soon. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And yeah, so if there's an opportunity to work with someone near you, I suggest you check it out. If you want to work with Dr. Pearson, hit him up too. Ladies and gents, thanks for being here. And thanks for always being a loyal listener to the podcast. If you did find value in what we talked about today, again, please share this podcast with at least one person you know and love. And don't forget to support our incredible sponsors, magbreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence, and use the code muscle10. You get hooked up with 10% off. If you just go over to Bioptimizers or Mag Breakthrough and use the code muscle10, you can get hooked up there off their entire site. They've got an incredible array of products now. It just continues to grow every month, every year. And they just add such great products. I value them so much, and it's something that's a staple in my medicine cabinet. Gents, ladies, cheers.
Thank you so much for tuning into Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.